the question I'm addressing is capitalism good for our health? And I guess I would say the short answer is it does depend who you are, but I think for most people in the world the answer is probably no, at least the form of capitalism we've had in the last 30 years. And I'm going to argue that markets can deliver some goods and services, but they don't really aid fair distribution. They're often exploitative of people and the environment, and they're concerned with profits above all else. And I think our challenge, and I'll, in the second half of my talk about this, assuming an absence of revolutionary political will to establish a completely new economic order, though I'm happy to talk about that in discussion time, is to regulate and progressively move to a system that is ecologically sustainable, equitable, and which promotes health and well-being. And I'm glad to see that these ideas have really been very much tossed around so far in the Festival of Ideas. So I think what's happened in the past few months is that the elephant of capitalism, which has been standing there in the room and we've taken for granted, has really sort of come out into the open. One commentator, William Tabb, has said of globalization, of capital, that our vision of it remains imperfect. Our task is made more difficult because our great elephant seems constantly to change its shape, even as the basic elements of its nature remain constant through these dramatic transformations. The central discourse of the early 21st century is making sense of the same old elephant, and note that it hasn't really changed its spots or wallpaper that much, and it's now seen in a new and different guise. Now, of course, there's a long tradition of people commenting on the impacts of capitalism on health. Anyone who's read Engels, he did some wonderful work in the 19th century looking at the impact of work on workers' health. And at Flinders University, we're still continuing that tradition, I have to say. And of course, that thought continued from the 19th century through the 20th century. I think the 60s saw a flowering of questioning of the benefits of capitalism, student protests, music, and a sort of an increased questioning of the way we organise ourselves. But of course, from the 1980s and the rise of neoliberalism and the subsequent fall of the Soviet Union meant that that kind of critique of capitalism was increasingly out of vogue, and many of us who were engaged in it were accused of being stuck in the 60s, or even worse, being an ageing hippie. So I don't know how many people here would consider themselves an ageing hippie. Not many are willing, oh yes, a few more are willing to admit to it. Okay, so the sort of capitalism I'm talking about are that really evolved from the late 70s onwards. Large corporations, especially financial sectors, making profit out of speculation with money. Much greater deregulation, cutbacks to public services and privatisation of many essential services, less environmental safeguards and social safety nets dismantled, and really a propensity to capture the total benefit of productivity gains for owners and managers, the tax burden really shifting from financial speculation to working people, and I'll produce some evidence for some of these claims later, and very little or no sign of ecological responsibility in the face of the hunt for profit maximisation, and a strong focus on consumerism. Those who you were at the previous session in this room where Peter Shergold, much of what he said I didn't agree with, but I think one of the things he said that was very good was that we need to shift to a greater focus on citizens. And of course, the size of transnational corporations has become huge. Here's just some listed, such as ExxonMobil, Walmart, Ford, and so on, just comparing their annual revenue with GDP of a range of countries, including Australia. But you can see that they're up there as a player as big as a country. And this has been something that has been new. Now, David Corton, who has written extensively, and if you're interested in reading more about this, I'd really recommend his work. He said these forces have transformed once beneficial corporations and financial institutions into instruments of a market tyranny that is extending its reach across the planet like a cancer, colonising ever more of the planet's living spaces, destroying livelihoods, displacing people, rendering democratic institutions impotent, and feeding on life in an insatiable quest for money. The problem is not business or the market per se, but a badly corrupted global system that is gyrating far beyond control. The dynamics of the system have become so powerful and perverse that it's becoming increasingly difficult for corporate managers to manage in the public interest, no matter how strong their moral values and commitment. And I think David put that extremely well. One of the things, as I said, that's happened in the past few years is a massive privatisation that I think has been very bad for our collective health. It's been of public goods that I would consider essential, such as gas, the way we heat, prisons, etc., in the past 30 years. In Adelaide, every time we turn on the tap, the cash registers are ringing in Paris, London and Houston, Texas. United Water owns Adelaide Supply and is a joint venture between the three water multinationals based in France. And in fact, it's interesting to note in terms of this power and influence that just three companies now control 75% of the world water business, which is quite scary. I want to draw your attention to this. I've just spent 3 years working on a World Health Organization commission that's called the Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, and I'll come back to that. But you'll see from this quote, and in a way I'm saying this to, we actually wrote this bit in our report before the financial crisis. And we actually said that these increasing number of, we were pointing out that there were more and more global financial crises and that they were having a major impact on health. And of course, to some extent, we were foreseeing what was about to happen just less than a month after we launched our report. At the time our report was launched in August 2008, The Economist magazine had an article on our report and said that, this group of people are baying at the moon. They didn't quite go so far as to say we were ageing hippies, but that was kind of the implication. I wonder if The Economist would still say that we were baying at the moon. And much of our work was to say that many of our regulatory systems that govern capitalism, that have set up globally to control and regulate, actually work in favour of big business. Things like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, they're very much based on economic contribution. So while rich countries account for, say, 20% of the IMF members and 15% of the world's population, they have vastly the majority of votes in the World Bank and IMF. And for instance, the CEOs are selected by the US and the EU. And I think there's a need, and we say this in our report, for much more transparency and democracy. And I think the interests of the TNCs, the transnational corporations, have been strongly supported by these bodies. You just have to take one example, such as trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights that have really protected the interests of big pharma. And of course, this has led to an absurd situation where, under the supposedly free trade system, countries such as Australia, the EU, and the US can actually give this massive amount of total agricultural support to the agricultural sector. And the orange bars are how much we give in overseas aid. So you can see what a big disparity that is. So bear that in mind. So we now have the absurd situation that a Japanese cow gets subsidized by $7 a day, and yet something like 40% of the total population lives on less than $2 a day. So there'd be 3.5 people living on the same amount of money as we subsidize a Japanese cow. The other thing we've talked about in this festival before is CEO earnings, and this is another part of the growing inequities, and I think this is symptomatic. But you can see, whereas at the end of the 80s, the ratio between full-time adult, this is for Australia, full-time adult wages was 18-1. By 2004 to 2005, it was 63-1. This isn't just a small increase. This is a massive, overwhelmingly large increase. Around the world, we can see growing inequities across countries, and this is just showing the ratios between rich and poor countries. So I think we're getting growing inequities within countries, and we're getting growing inequities between countries. And you can see the ratio, which is the important thing. The ratio has gone up from 60-1 to 122-1. So that kind of pattern. If we look at global wealth distribution, which hasn't changed that much over the 20th century. It was unfair and it still is unfair. And much of the so-called success of global capitalism in the West has rested on the fact that we've been able to take resources from a lot of poor countries. And I think this is shown in this. So if you take North America, which has 6% of the population and about $190,000 wealth per population, they have 34% of the share of the world's wealth. Look at Africa, which has 10% of the population, very little wealth per adult, and has just 1% of the wealth share. So again, a pattern of increased inequities. In Australia, there seems to appear to be an increased concentration of wealth, with 95% of total wealth owned by the richest 50% and 44% of our wealth owned by just 10% of people. Now you can see, I haven't put the figures, but that leaves very little for people at the bottom. And while there's some debate about what happened to equality of income in the 90s and the early 21st century, generally the better off have had much higher increases according to the ABS, and it seems inequity has increased. And a similar pattern in the US, Canada and the UK. So the point I'm now going to make very clearly is that how we organise society, the decisions we make about how we distribute wealth, how much we rip off poor countries, how much overseas aid we have, how much agricultural subsidy we give, has very real impacts on health. It gets under our skins, it gets into our brains and our behaviour. And I'd say no man sick, no man or woman is an island. We all reflect the social, cultural, political and economic systems that we are born in, that we live in, that we work in, and that we play in. If you look at life expectancy at birth, you'll see that there was particularly a steep increase, I think, in the 50s through to the 80s, through to the 70s, and I think that reflected the fact that we were doing much more to regulate global capitalism. You can see how that's bottomed out since then, and some commentators are now predicting that in the future we will have declining life expectancies. For certain ages of women in the US, there already is a decline, and the projections are that may continue. But look at Africa, the bottom line. You can see how Africa hasn't done well. And you might say, well, surely that's AIDS. But AIDS actually deeply reflects the conditions in which people live, such as structural adjustment packages, the policies of the World Bank, the way in which health systems have been privatised and become dysfunctional. And we can also see that we have growing health inequities. What this slide shows is that while overall, say, there's been an improvement in infant mortality, for OECD countries that's been a 29% improvement, whereas in Africa it's only been a 9% improvement. Net result is the inequities have grown, so we're becoming a less equitable world. And people might then ask the questions, and this is the question that I basically have spent the last 3 years asking together with my colleagues on the Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. Why do we have health inequities, and why do we have less than optimum population health? In Japan, which has the highest life expectancy in the world, people live to their just sort of the earlier, about 84, 85. In Sierra Leone, people live to less than 40. And that is purely because of the way that we organise things. Now, is that about behaviour of Sierra Leoneans? Is it because Sierra Leoneans aren't taking enough exercise? Or is it because it's conditions of everyday life and the way we organise the distribution of goods in our society? And our commission considered all of those and thought that the last 2 dot points were the most important. The second dot point was important, having access to healthcare, but behaviour really didn't make a big contribution if you just try and change behaviour on its own. It's those other things that were so important. So the basic logic of the Commission was, what good does it do to treat people's illnesses but to give them no choice to go back to or no control over the conditions that made them sick? And that's the task that we set ourselves. As I said, we launched our report in August 2008. Was launched by Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization, and she said health inequity really is a matter of life and death. And that was a very powerful point from our report. We made a whole series of recommendations, and the whole report is fully downloadable on the web. If you put Commission on the Social Determinants of Health into Google, you will find the link. We looked at daily living conditions. We looked at how what happens to you in the first 3 years of life, how important it is to have social protection across the life course and universal healthcare that's publicly funded. And then we looked at the underpinning of that, power, money and resources. And we particularly looked at market responsibility as one issue, and that's what I'm really going to talk a bit about now to link in this question of capitalism. Now, part of our thinking this question through was to look at what's increasingly be called an epidemiology. Epidemiology is just how we distribute diseases or how diseases are distributed and what factors affect them, of equality. And there's been some key books in recent years. Some of you may have seen the work by Richard Wilkinson and his co-author Kate Pickett, called The Spirit Level, which has had quite a bit of coverage in the Australian press. And just as an advert, that Flinders University is bringing Richard to Adelaide at the end of August, the 28th of August, so email me if you want details to hear him yourself. He has argued very strongly and produced evidence that the more equal a society is, the healthier it is. Now, that may be because more equal societies that distribute their income equally also have better social policies. But there's certainly a huge evidence that more equity leads to less crime in a society and more cohesion. And I think any of you can see why that would be the case. If you think of cities like Rio de Janeiro, where the rich people have to lock themselves into suburbs, build gated communities, you can see how that would work. But this is the sort of evidence he produces. So here's mental illness mapped against the country, and you'll see that Australia has a high income inequality compared with other countries, but you can see how there's a strong relationship between mental illness and income inequality. This is for illegal drug use, and look at where Australia is on that. I think that's making quite a powerful message. And here is the other way round. This is how much countries spend on foreign aid. And you can see, while the G8 have agreed that all rich countries should spend 0.8 of their national income on foreign aid, you can see that we spend only about 0.2 something, very, very low. But you can also see that those countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, that are relatively equal, are also more disposed to spending more money on foreign aid. So again, that link between social policy, which I think is really important. So how does this come to health? Well, let's look at this. This is the pathway from inequity to mental health. So if you take a pattern of unregulated or inadequately regulated capitalism, and that leads to higher degrees of inequity, then there's various paths. One is about less trust, which I think leads to more crime, less social cohesion. One is about weaker community life, because people don't trust one another so much, and therefore there's less cohesion and cooperation in the society. And one is about more concern with status. So if you live in a society where there's a lot of difference and you see the Ferraris and Rolls Royces driving around, then we are, as human beings, we're very much about comparing ourselves, keeping up with the Joneses. That leads to more concern with status, and all of those things lead to more social evaluation anxieties, more narcissistic behaviour, which leads to, as in a biological sense, raised levels of stress hormones, which leads, in this case, I've put to mental illness. But as you'll see on the next slide, when you look at these biological pathways, the pathways to poor health shows the three main systems affected, the endocrine system, the nervous system, and the immune system, and shows that individual factors may play some role, but some people cope more than others. And usually those who cope more than others are those who have good resources in their life, so their stress levels return to normal. So this is really how these inequities get into our brain and under our skin. And I think the sociologist Raymond Ahrens has put that very well. When inequity becomes too great, the idea of community becomes impossible. And yet the idea of community is very essential to all our health. I think Stilwell and Jordan, who have done a lot of work on inequity in Australia, also make this point and say that the redress of economic inequality is central to the achievement of a good society. Now, you might say, but surely wealth is good for our health. You might think, surely wealthier countries are healthier. Well, this is showing life expectancy and GDP per capita. And what it shows is, you see where the graph starts levelling off. That's at about $10,000 per year. And if you look at the US, you'll see that the US actually has lower life expectancy than some countries which have a lower income than it. So this graph is a really important graph, because it's saying it's not just about wealth. Up to $10,000 a year, it probably is about wealth, but beyond that, it is about other things. And this is one comparison I like to give, partly because Costa Rica is just south of the US. If you compare life expectancy at birth, Costa Rica is doing 2 years better than the US. Does a little worse on infant mortality, but on life expectancy it does better. Now, in gross national income, though, they have about 1/10 of the US, and in terms of health expenditure per capita, they have less. They only spend $350 per head. And if you look at the Happy Planet Index, which the New Economic Foundation has done in London, where they compare life satisfaction, life expectancy, and ecological footprint, you can see that Costa Rica ranks 3rd and the US ranks 150th. So this is the clear demonstration that whether or not all of us are healthy is just not about income and wealth. It's about many other things. Just to show you a similar picture in terms of the amount that the US and UK spend on medical care, you can see the UK with its national health system is spending less than half than the United States. This is some work that Michael Marmot and colleagues did and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And what that shows is that for heart disease, diabetes and cancer, that when you look at middle-aged people, the people in England are doing much better than the US. Now, I would argue that's not just about health services, that's also about a whole lot of other things of how the social wage is expended in the UK. But again, it just shows that picture that when we take the country in the world that's most committed to that sort of free market model, it doesn't appear to be that good for health. Michael Marmot, who chaired the commission I was on, was very clear that health reflects social organisation, and he's written a great book called The Status Syndrome, where he points out that social cohesion is much more likely in equal societies and that excessive individualism is not good for health. He argues that very clearly, and he talks about how a commitment to fairness leads to those fair social policies. It's a very strong argument. And there's an increasing number of people who are arguing about the psychological impacts of what we might call neo-capitalism. James, in The Selfish Capitalists, has talked about a set of values that increases our vulnerabilities to emotional distress. Clive Hamilton and Richard Dennis in Affluenza, and Pam Stavropoulos in Living Under Liberalism. And they point to this paradox. I think Richard Layard is an economist who's written a book on happiness, and he said as Western societies have got richer, their people have become no happier. And Pam Stavropoulos makes the point that while we're very well off and we have high levels of personal freedom, compared to the rest of the world, we also have high levels of personal depression. And if you think about the graph I showed with mental illness plotted against the degree of inequity, that was shown very clearly. I think, and a lot of these commentators think, that that's very much about consumerism and the impact that it has on our mental health. You know, the competition to have the latest gadget, the fact that we're subjected to a barrage of advertising, and I think increasingly material objects becoming central in terms of satisfaction in life. So just to finish, I just didn't want to leave you all wanting to slit your wrists about everything. So I wanted to think, well, what's positive? What's hopeful? And it seems to me one of the messages from our commission was we weren't very convinced by corporate social responsibility. We actually want corporate accountability. Social responsibility is voluntary, and we suggested that accountability was more important. And that's accountability for environmental and social impact. And I think one of the biggest ways that corporations should be accountable is paying fair corporate tax. So if you think about it, the ratio of revenue from individual tax compared to company tax has changed from the early 60s, when it was roughly 2-1, to now it's nearly 4-1. So in other words, as citizens, we're having to pay more tax to keep things going because the corporations have globalized and got out of national taxation regimes. And do we want them to be socially responsible? Not really. I'd be much happier if they were accountable and left governments to ensure they're socially responsible. Very important point, I think. So it's about regulation. And I think I really wanted to draw on Don Dunstan's legacy here, as we're in Adelaide, and I know he would have loved the Festival of Ideas. And of course, what Don said at one of the speeches, I don't know how many people were there when he spoke in the entertainment centre. Yeah, I think people would remember that. That was a great moment in South Australian history. It was a Tuesday night, it was weather like today, and thousands of people came to hear Don. And what did he say in that? He said, we have to temper the marketplace by action. He said, for in community interest, we know that we intervene or we sink. And I think that's a really crucial message. So there is increased civil society protest and questioning of global capitalism. That's happening around the world. The World Social Forum is asking the question of, is another world possible? I've been very involved with the People's Health Movement, which is a global network of people's health movements, which is based, we have a secretariat in Cape Town and Cairo, and we have country circles really advocating against the ways in which economic rationalism is impacting on people's health. very strong movement in South Africa where people are recognising that health is a human right, and that if health is a human right, so are the conditions that lead to health, such as housing. Again, we've produced some fantastic alternative health reports which we call Global Health Watch, where we've looked at a whole lot of these kind of issues of how pharmaceutical companies are behaving and how the environment is suffering as a result of the quest for profit. So basically, the question is, will we be able to shift our systems and change our mindsets? I think that we're going to need an interventionist state. We are going to have to regulate. We need good global governance for human rights and public good, including probably global taxation regimes to stop corporations being able to avoid their responsibilities. But to get that, we need to create conditions for local democracy and the exercise of citizenship and protection of rights of citizens to protest, because that's increasingly being threatened. And there has to be huge support for poor communities to develop their skills, their capacities and their abilities, because they're massive and they're greatly overused. I also think we have to imagine alternative economic systems. I don't know what they are. I'm sure all of us here have ideas, but I do think they'll be small scale, rooted in local communities, and rooted within people's lives, and give them a sense of obligations to the communities in which they operate. And those systems will have to support and enhance people's physical and mental health. We have to have other means of measuring progress, and we have to have governments that will regulate. And actually, this supports Marx's vision of the rich human being. What Marx was writing about was trying to develop an economic system that would support a richness of life for human beings. And I think we need to shift our economic and political systems. There's been much talk about left-right brain thinking, but at the moment we really are focusing our whole society on economic growth, but it's unsustainable, it's involved in a horrible consumerism and a competition, and it's leading to inequities. We have to make this shift to sustainability, to increasing social connections, to having tolerant, diverse and accepting communities. And those things will lead to healthy weight, healthy minds and healthy bodies and healthy populations. So thank you very much.